Jordan has survived the Arab Spring relatively unscathed, at least so far. Perhaps it's because the king has promised reform. But he's now on his fourth prime minister since the start of last year. And the changes proposed so far won't do enough to satisfy his critics. They say King Abdullah is just buying time and not serious about reform. And this in a country seen as critical to peace in the region, not least because of its troubled neighbours, Syria, Iraq and Israel. My guest today is Nasser Judeh, Jordan's foreign minister. So how much time has Jordan got to sort itself out? Nasser Judeh, welcome to Hard Talk.
Great to be here.
Now, 4 prime ministers since the start of last year would suggest that Jordan is having a problem with its reforms. Can it change enough to satisfy its people and to avoid the uprising that many of your neighbours have seen?
Well, I would start by saying that the problem may be in the pace of reforms rather than with reforms. And I think that you've seen changes of government so frequently in the last 12 or 14 months, simply because we have reform that is led from the top, led by the king, who has actually set the ultimate goal of reform, to arrive at a situation where we can have parliamentary governments, where all the constitutional amendments were passed last year, but now we are awaiting implementation through the different legislation through parliament. So I think it's the problem of the pace of reforms, and I think that's why you've had a frequency of prime ministers and governments. And at the end of the day, it's not about the number of governments or the number of prime ministers. It's about the reform being on track.
Lots of changes, and he has been intent on having elections before the end of the year.
And the last government, by the way, left office simply because the king had promised his people and the world that we're going to see municipal and parliamentary elections.
We'll get into why the last prime minister resigned. It was the first one to actually resign before he was pushed. But that's part of the argument, is that you're ending up in a situation where he's forcing the pace of elections, yes, intent on change, but it is still the case that there will be elections to a parliament, and then the king will decide who the prime minister is, who runs the government.
Not quite. Not quite. Right now, I think one has to understand the Jordanian political system in a way that reflects reality. Right now, the king has the constitutional power to appoint a prime minister. This prime minister, as is the case as we speak, this prime minister has to present to parliament, to the lower house of parliament, his political program, and he gets confidence through parliament based on his political program. That's the system right now, where the king wants to take the country.
Democratic systems around the world, democratic peoples around the world would want to choose their own government. And under the proposed reforms, it is still the case that the king is choosing the prime minister.
Different countries have different systems, but we're not in disagreement over this. And if you allow me just to finish my earlier thought, at the end of this process that the king has set out, you will have political parties elected to parliament, and the king will have to choose the prime minister based on the majority in parliament. So actually,
when will that be?
As soon as we have the elections.
So by the
end of this year, and that's why the king wants to move ahead with the elections.
This year, the king will choose a prime minister from the majority parliament party,
or short of having clear majorities of political parties, because we don't have ripe political parties as yet. We have one major
organised. And as you will know, the detail of the law means that there is a limit on the size of parties, because only a certain number of seats have been given over to party lists.
Absolutely incorrect. Only a given number of seats was given to the party's lists, which is 15 as things stand, depending on how it's debated in Parliament. But the Parliament is 130 plus members that can all be belonging to political parties. But in order to ensure that there's a broad spectrum of political parties represented in Parliament, a list was set aside for parties, a quota, if you will.
You will know that the Islamic Action Front, which is the political front for the Muslim Brotherhood, saw that directed at them. That they were. Was it?
Let me give you 3 examples. In 1989, we had a one-person multiple vote system, which ensured a majority for the Muslim Brotherhood. at the time. That moved in 1993 to a one-person, one-vote system, which the Islamic Action Front at the time said was targeting them. Then we moved in 2010 to a one-man, one-vote, plus one virtual district. They didn't like that, and they boycotted elections.
Okay,
and this
so
time
are they not worth listening to, because they always oppose everything?
Absolutely, they are a major component of our political system,
but
they're not the only ones.
Okay, but they're unlikely to stand in these elections because they're unhappy with them, aren't they? Well, and I'm assuming they'll be allowed to stand. Would they be allowed to stand?
Not only are they allowed to stand, but they are constantly being encouraged to stand. But I think the political argument here, and I'm sure you will agree with me based on your political system here, that you can't have a political elections law, electoral law actually, that services one particular political party at the expense of everybody else.
Sure. So. But let's go to where you mentioned that why the last Prime Minister had resigned. An al-Qassani, his decision to resign was basically, and this is a man, let's explain who he is. He's a man who spent 10 years as a judge at the International Court of Justice in The Hague. He's considered a respected independent figure and considered a reformer. Now, he basically decided to stand down as Prime Minister because of a decision that the king was effectively overruling him while he was out of the country. And the belief was, and people say, look here, and the feeling from his side was that despite all the talk from the king that, look, the Prime Minister is running the country, that actually nothing had changed. It's the king who makes all the decisions and ultimately was taking decisions while the Prime Minister was out of the country.
Let me put it to you this way. The former Prime Minister is indeed a respected judge and a gentleman who had his presence at the International Court of Justice for over a decade. And it was actually His Majesty the King 10 years ago who sent all sorts of recommendations, letters to heads of state and heads of government to lobby for his election to the court and appointment to the court. So he is respected. He came against that backdrop. But let's not forget that he came in October 2011 when the King, through his initiative and through working between Parliament and the government, had managed to pass the constitutional amendments, prepare and send to the Parliament many of the many of the political reform laws, and the King brought him as a Prime Minister to lead us into the next phase of implementation and fast pace of reforms. I think there was disagreement over the pace, and I disagree with you actually over the real reason why the Prime Minister had left. The disagreement was, and he did indeed resign, was over the fact that the King wanted an ordinary session of Parliament to be extended in order to finish the laws. But the Prime Minister said no, we need 6 weeks off, and then to have an extraordinary session with 12 laws as opposed to just a political reform law.
That is as I understand it too. Yeah. But the King called in his deputy while he was out of the country and said, sign it to extend the parliamentary term, or you go with your boss, i.e. you go against the king. And as al-Qassani said on his resignation, I won't accept instructions from the palace. Basically, he saw himself as mere window dressing.
Well, absolutely not. And when the king did not call anybody, by the way, it was the chief of the royal court who acts on behalf of the king in passing messages. Exactly as in any system of government, you have the head of state, and you can't have the head of state getting into the daily details.
Okay. But this, in a sense, goes to a lot of the criticism, as you know, of what goes on in Jordan, that actually, even when the king might want change, he's frustrated by those who are around him. So was it the king's decision or those around him?
It was the king's wish, according to his constitutional powers, that the parliament be extended so that they can continue with their political reform map.
The trouble is with this, the argument, and the king said afterwards he wasn't reforming things fast enough. The trouble is, if he thinks that that Prime Minister, Qassani, was not a fast enough reformer, look at who he's replaced him with. He's replaced him with someone who has a reputation as, he was a former Prime Minister, Chief of the Royal Court, an ultra-conservative bureaucrat, Fayez al-Tarani. Everybody in Jordan, you'll know the reaction, was just, this is not a man who can reform.
And you're actually basing your analysis on scientific research. I mean, did you actually hear from all Jordanians who said that they think that he's an ultra-conservative? I think there was a lot of good feeling about Fayez Tarani. And by the way, there was a lot of good feeling about al-Qassani before that. Well, 2 days after his appointment, he sent the much-awaited list of recommendations for the names of the Independent Election Commission. We had been waiting for that since the passing of the law for about 5 weeks. I think that's one big test best for the first 48 hours in government.
Okay, well, let me quote to you Araib Rintawi of the Al-Quds Centre for Political Studies. It doesn't send a reassuring message about reform. The new lineup this is from somebody else within the University of Jordan, does not give the impression that it's up to reforms. He doesn't have
I happen to be part of that lineup, and I do believe in reform, so I disagree with Mr. Barari.
But that's quite interesting, because you've been part of the lineup since you became foreign minister at the beginning of 2009.
That's right.
But you were a minister on and off since the end of the 90s.
Yes.
You were, until quite recently, married to a cousin of the king. So you are, in a sense, one of those who's in the royal court. And I wonder, therefore, having been such a close observer of the political scene in Jordan over all these years, where you think the slow pace of reform is coming from. Because ever since the king got in on the death of his father, 13 years ago now, he's promised reforms. So what is the problem? What's delaying these promised reforms?
Okay, two things. First of all, I mean, all governments are His Majesty's governments at the end of the day, just like in this country. There is a constitution, and this constitution has now been amended. But let me point to something that is extremely important here, Sarah, and that is the king is the ultimate benefactor and beneficiary of political reform. So I think it does not stand to logical reasoning to say that the king is changing governments so that he can slow reform or buy time, as I've seen in some pieces that appeared in the last couple of weeks. The king is not only leading the reform, but he wants to see it through. I mean, he's saying, I want parliamentary elections by the end of 2012. The king was asked recently by an American journalist if he is willing to give up some of his constitutional powers within 5 years. And he said, absolutely not. I want to do it sooner. He's very comfortable. He's in a very comfortable place, very comfortable in his own skin, and he's leading reform. And by the way, if you look at the last 12 months in Jordan, the gentle breeze, as I call it, of Arab Spring that has come across Jordan, as opposed to the turbulent events and the gale force winds that we've seen in other countries, is due to the king, because the king is the safety valve. He's the one who brings about consensus.
So I
think we must have done something right where freedom of expression is guaranteed in Jordan.
That brings me on to freedom of expression, because is it right that a journalist should be locked up for reporting what he'd been told, that the king told MPs not to indict a former minister? And you'll know the case that I'm referring to.
Yes, I know the case. I don't know the details of it, but I know the case. But at the same time, you get an overzealous, overeager prosecutor who locks somebody up. It could be a flaw in the system. But at the end of the day, if somebody reports something that is inaccurate or based on a piece of hearsay, then they are accountable. I mean, I'm not saying they should be locked up.
They should be locked up.
No. I'm making it very clear that they shouldn't be locked up. But I'm just telling you.
He has been locked up, and he's still inside, despite protests and concerns about it, and protests made to the highest
level. There are countries in the world where, unfortunately, people are locked up because of sedition, because they're threatening to overthrow. Even democratic countries, the best examples thereof. I'm not saying that the system is perfect, but I'm saying that the system is doing something right.
Can you justify how a journalist who reports something on a website, he's the editor of this particular website, Gerasa News, he's in prison at the moment because of something he reported that he was told by an MP, by a parliamentarian?
It doesn't matter who he was told this piece of information by. This information usually, and you're a renowned journalist, I think has to be accurate. And it has to reflect the truth. Like I said, I don't know the details of how he was locked up, but like I told you, in a system, in any system.
Free speech.
No. Free speech means that you have to respect the integrity and the freedoms of others, and you have to make sure that the information that you publish is actually accurate.
And for a reporter
in Jordan, we may have our flaws in the system, Sarah, and you know that, but we're the first to admit our mistakes.
And this is not a mistake?
Well, we have to look at the case in itself. We have to look at the details. We have to look at the information. I mean, how can you say that the king has told MPs to, close corruption files when this is actually not true? I mean, I'm telling you, at least in Jordan, not only do we guarantee freedom of expression, but freedom after expression, which is not the case in many countries.
So you can guarantee that case will be looked into, and this possibly overzealous judge that you refer to?
It is the king himself, and I've been in meetings who has said, but by the way, what is this case and what's happened and why is my name being used? Right. But the king, at the end of the day, the king has his constitutional powers, but he also has his constitutional constraints. No government can sit in office without getting the confidence of Parliament, even if the king appoints it. So.
You're foreign minister in a country that we're talking about its own problems, but of course you're sitting alongside neighbours with tremendous problems, not least Syria. Do you think that civil war can be avoided in Syria?
It was a chilling moment to hear Kofi Annan speak a couple of days ago after briefing the Security Council, when he said that the failure of his plan, might be the beginning or the making of a civil war in Syria. And I hope we can all avert that, because Syria is a very complicated country in terms of the ethnic and religious mosaic of the country itself. You've got Sunni Arabs, Sunni Kurds, the Christians, the Druze, the Alawites, a whole host of minorities that in some case represent a majority. It is our only hope at this stage. The only game in town is to see Kofi Annan's plan succeed. Right now, we're concentrating on one of the aspects of the plan, which is the end of violence and the monitors. But I think there are 5 other points that we need to look at, which is political dialogue. On the 16th of this month, there will be the beginning of a dialogue between the opposition members under the auspices of the Arab League. Let's hope that this is the beginning of political dialogue. The solution in Syria has got to be a political solution. Cannot be anything else, or else.
But as Jordan, as King Abdullah, one of the first to say it, the president, Assad, has to go.
King Abdullah did say that in the context of what would he do if he had been in the same position. He said it's not a question of, yes, even if I were him, I would step down, but it has to be in a way that doesn't just change faces, but the system has to change. It's not about changing faces.
Okay, but does President Assad have to go?
It is up to the Syrians at the end of the day. And I think at the end of the day, you said Jordan. We are close. It's not like a situation where we faced in the past with Iraq, where you have 900 kilometers of nothing before you get to the nearest town. We are contiguous to Syria. We have towns on the Syrian border, on the Jordanian border, that are contiguous to each other. We have long historic relations, social connections, families. And at the end of the day, we have 62% of our imports that come by land through Syria. So we have interest in the stability of Syria. And that's why we say the military option is not really an option that we want. What we want to see is a political solution that ensures a smooth transition. Who the faces are is up to the Syrians.
But a transition from President Assad, I notice you're not particularly saying, and I appreciate.
Well, what I am saying is that it is up to the Syrian regime to reconcile itself with the people of Syria after such a year of violence.
And in the meantime, because of your proximity, thousands of Syrians are fleeing into Jordan. And of course, Jordan has a history of taking refugees, obviously Palestinians, Iraqis, now Syrians. How destabilizing is it for Jordan?
Not destabilizing at all. I think, if I may mix the first component of this program with the second, I think one tends to see that people always associate events that are taking place in Jordan with the stability or instability of Jordan. For example, demonstrations in Jordan are a source of strength because this is not new to Jordan. We've had demonstrations since the birth of Jordan. Opposition is not a threat to Jordan's stability. Changing governments is not a threat to Jordan's stability. The Arab Spring is not a threat to Jordan's stability. And the events in Syria. I mean, we've had, in the 50s and 60s, we used to have, every other day we'd have a coup d'etat in Syria, and Jordan's still here.
About your ability to absorb the thousands of people and your readiness for it.
Well, we are ready. We're not trying to bring it on, but we're ready. We have over 110,000 Syrians in Jordan today. And this is a number that not too many people are aware of, because
but this includes people who have Syrian passports and may have been there before.
No. These are people who have come into Jordan since the beginning of the events in Syria. 14,000 of whom crossed the fence illegally at a time when they were being shot at, seeking refuge and seeking medical care. But the rest, because we had no visa requirements between Jordan and Syria, would come in their cars, fleeing from Syria. I mean, they're not called refugees per se, but they are, for all intents and purposes, refugees who are not in Syria because of a situation there. So they moved in to Jordan. They've gone to different cities and towns. I'm in discussion, as are many of my colleagues, with different international organizations, UN agencies, to see how we can help. And you're right. Jordan has always been a haven, a refuge. We have 400,000 or 500,000 Iraqis. We are the largest host of Palestinian refugees, and we are now having to accommodate our Syrian brethren. So.
I want to ask you about another matter, that of Abu Qatada. Now, for years, Britain has been wanted to send, he's a Jordanian radical cleric, and they wanted to send him back, and he's been fighting extradition, and he claims that he would be tortured if, now as we know, when he goes back to Jordan. He claims he will be tortured. I wonder, will you be able to prove to the world that he will not be mistreated or has not been mistreated at some point?
Well, he was tried in absentia, first of all, in the first trial. And what we have been saying to the world, actually, before we prove it to the world, we've got to just live up to our own standards, which we do, and perhaps please our own conscience, and tell you that the Jordanian constitution bans torture and bans evidence acquired through torture. Now, I think the proof of the pudding is in the eating. I mean, let Abu Qatada, if he ever comes to Jordan, we'll see whether he gets a fair trial, whether due process of law does take place or not.
Okay,
I think the world has got to benchmark Jordan, not just on this, but on so many other things, and I think we've passed with flying colours.
Except you will
Except the case that you're talking about, and we'll get back to it.
Okay, but it's not just that case. You know that there is great concerns about torture, or despite all the claims. And for example, there's a recent constitutional prohibition that, according to the Roger Smith, a lawyer with the UK human rights organisation Justice, makes little difference to practice on the ground because of cases that have come again and again. So there is concern.
There is no systematic torture in Jordan. It is not allowed, it is not legal, and like I told you, sometimes, I mean, I deal with human rights organizations all the time. They come and see me and we interact with them, and our different agencies of government interact with them. We've opened up our prisons. In fact, we had a delegation from Human Rights Watch, and we said just pick and choose any prison that you want. They found, I think, individual cases of mistreatment at the time.
Okay, well, let me take
one or two.
Okay, so 31st of March, there was a number of demonstrators arrested.
Yep.
6 of them gave evidence to Human Rights Watch where they said they had received barbaric beatings in custody. One described how the police had taken their name tags off and then beat me with boots and shoes, punched me on the face and body, took all my clothes so I was naked, beat me until I blacked out.
I haven't seen this, but quite honestly, this was a demonstration where the demonstrators, if I'm not mistaken, I was out of the country at the time, attacked the police. And
so does that make it justifiable?
No. But this is, I mean, I don't know if this qualifies as torture, but it certainly does not in any way resemble the way you dealt with your riots here at the time. I mean, if anybody who was smacked on the hand here in London would refer to that as torture, I think you'd be upset.
This is what happened to demonstrators who, when they were taken into custody, and it was in custody that these beatings happened.
He's saying his name tag was removed,
He was saying the police took off their own name tags so that they wouldn't be identified.
Okay.
And there were 6 people who gave evidence to Human Rights Watch.
If this is the 31st of March group that was outside the Prime Minister or near the Prime Ministry, I think there's an investigation based on some of the allegations that is ongoing right now. But I can tell you, and I'm very, very confident in what I say, that there is no systematic torture in Jordan. It's illegal.
So despite the fact of the European Court's concerns, not least in the whether Abu Qatada could be deported, I mean, the thing, even when they accepted assurances given by the Jordanian government, we've
been dealing with the British government, not with the European Court.
Indeed, and the British government gave them the assurances that you had given to them. But they still said the evidence against Abu Qatada was found under torture.
But he's just lost an appeal with the European Court.
Because of the fine, but that was their outstanding concern. So to suggest that torture isn't a problem...
Yeah, but I mean, I think that is quite contextual, that he lost an appeal with the European Court.
So when he goes back and he faces retrial, the evidence against him will not have been obtained under torture.
It is illegal under the Constitution to practice torture or to acquire evidence through torture. That is something that you can rest assured Jordan will live up to.
Will Abu Qatada ever be seen in public again, do you think?
I'm not going to get into British domestic politics. I'm
talking about Jordan.
Right now, it's a question of your dealings with the European Court, and I don't want to get into that. That's quite a minefield.
But we know now that he can be deported. And
should he be deported? Should he be deported to Jordan? Should he be deported? He will receive a fair trial with due process of law under the Constitution, according to our laws. You can rest assured of that.
Nasser Judeh, thank you for coming on HARDtalk.
Thank you very much.